Hey, good afternoon, class. Welcome in. We are going to have our third discussion now on imperialism, and we're going to shift our focus away from Africa. We focused our attention on there for the first two discussions. Now we're going to start moving into Asia, and we're going to see a couple people get involved that are a little bit unexpected. And we'll get into that in just a moment. But I want to open up our discussion as we get into Asia by taking a look at this first image on your notes. So again, we have England, Great Britain, kind of represented in a political cartoon here as an octopus, okay? This octopus has different tentacles that are stretching across the globe, different areas, Egypt, South Africa, India, and we're seeing just how powerful they've become at the expense of the local populations, at the expense of the people that are living there. That same theme is going to continue as we move into Asia, okay? So let's open up things here. We're going to have more of a discussion on this in our fourth discussion. We want to take a look at the early parts here of British rule in India. Okay, so the British East India Company asserted itself as a major trade operation in India during the 1800s. Now, once thought to be a private colony, India came under direct rule from the British after a failed rebellion. The British, after this point, are going to really rule about 3/5 of India, while the remaining 550 states were ruled by local princes. So remember, India is basically its own subcontinent. We remember that in the first semester. Massive area, mostly controlled by the British. Now, there are going to be some positives, but there are a lot of negatives attached to this. British rule is going to lead to new ways of life for the people of India. These included more education, the building of hospitals, the building of roads, bridges, infrastructure. All these things are being developed now in India. Okay, but at the same time, businessmen are seeking profits. They're trying to extract those resources, common theme that we've seen across the board. Now, those are some positives that are being brought. However, although these new ways of life benefited some citizens, a majority of Indian citizens were plagued by deadly famines and periods of starvation in the late 1800s. So you have extreme poverty, you have extreme starvation, and it's wiping out many, many people. Now remember, India currently, again, second highest population in the world behind China. So this is a very highly populated area. Okay, we're going to focus our attention more on India and China in our fourth discussion. Okay, now here is where things are going to be interesting. We're going to see Japan. Japan is going to get on the map and get themselves involved with imperialism. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration quickly became to the forefront and started to modernize Japan. The Tokugawa shogun was overthrown, and an emperor was installed as its supreme leader. So again, the shogun had led medieval times up into the 1800s. Now all of a sudden we start seeing a shift. Japan's desire to westernize their culture and society became very evident in this transition. Traditional social hierarchies were removed in favor of more democratic practices. Now, all of a sudden, land-owning citizens could now vote in free elections. The Diet, or Japanese National Assembly, would elect members to help these decision-making processes. This allowed a handful of powerful politicians to grab power away from the emperor. We have to keep this in mind, as it can be kind of a precursor to what we see during the 20th century in the buildup to World War II. Also, to go along with that buildup, Japan begins to mobilize. Okay, so we see industrialization and territorial gains. Japan's rapid transition in government also led to an overhaul in industrialization. If they were going to westernize, they were going to have to modernize themselves, and so you start seeing factories. If you know anything about Japan, it is a series of 4 islands, very similar to how Great Britain is in Europe. Okay, isolated, doesn't necessarily have the most natural resources. So this process mimics the West as factories, assembly lines, communications, import of raw materials, and trade begin to thrive. Now, the Japanese are going to look to expand. Again, they don't necessarily have everything on those islands. So they're going to expand their territory, and they're going to zero in on nearby Korea in 1894. Koreans wanted independence from China and got support from Japan, thus involving basically the two rivals. And again, in modern times, Japanese, Chinese, Korean people, there are still a lot of animosities. This evolves into the First Sino-Japanese War. Japan was able to swiftly defeat the Chinese with its methods of modernization and industrialization. So, modern combat tactics, modern weaponry. It allows to grant Korea its independence, but they're going to have a lot of influence in Korea. Now, out of all of this, Japan is also going to absorb the island of Taiwan. So we have Japan on the map. And as we can see here, again, a new array of countries moving in, and we see a ton of different areas being controlled by many different powers. But Japan is going to be the first really kind of new power on the map. Another one we're going to talk about here in just a moment. So actions in Southeast Asia. Actions in Southeast Asia, products such as tea, oil, tin, and spices were abundant in this region. Great Britain, France, and Netherlands are all going to have stakes, and the United States is also going to join the fray. Great Britain, essentially, again, they're going to control Burma and Singapore, which became prime locations for trade and naval bases. Now, France, this is where things get really tricky, especially for the Vietnamese. Okay, France is going to move into places like Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And again, they're going to try to assimilate the French culture into these areas. Neighboring Siam would rule on its own and had to deflect tension between Britain and France. Sound familiar? This region would become known as French Indochina. And the Vietnamese, throughout history, had had a history of defending themselves and essentially expelling anybody that tried to take over. The French are there, but they're going to have a lot of issues moving forward. And then lastly, the Dutch. The Dutch are still kind of clinging to some of these possessions across the world. The Dutch East Indies were a vast chain of islands in the Pacific, and this, through imperialism, through industrialization, through modernization, is going to become modern-day Indonesia. But the last person that we want to, or last group, not the last person, the last nation that gets involved here is the U.S. So the United States, again, late 1800s, is going to jump into the imperialism pool. And the United States started to carve out its own empire for itself in the Pacific. Let's take a look at Hawaii. So the annexation of Hawaii resulted in the overthrow of Queen Leleulekilani, okay? The U.S. had sent businessmen to usher her away from control, paving the way for annexation, okay? Hawaii's fertile land and warm climate led to a prosperous production of pineapples and sugarcane. So that was the original incentive. Eventually, Hawaii is going to become a major travel destination. Along with Hawaii, you've got the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island. After fighting battles against the Spanish during the Spanish-American War, the U.S. seized control of the Philippines. Guam was also ceded away from the Spanish. Ultimately, the Filipino people either relished the U.S. control or they fought back to seek independence. They wanted to have the islands to themselves. A famous rebellion was led by a man by the name of Emilio Aguinaldo, and that lasted for 3 years in defiance of U.S. rule. His effort came up short in 1902 as guerrilla warfare failed to boot out the Americans. American influence is going to stay on the islands throughout and up into World War II. Aguinaldo, for his efforts, was captured and sent into exile on Guam. As you can see here are images of Queen Leleulekilani and Emilio Aguinaldo. Again, each of them having significance, each of them being overthrown by U.S. imperialism. So now, all of a sudden, you've got the U.S., you've got Japan in the mix, and this is really kind of telling a tale of where things are going. And again, as we get into the 20th century, these rivalries are going to intensify, and again, we're going to see, as we know, 2 major world wars, and a lot of it stems from this imperialism. Okay? We're going to have a journal log. We're going to continue working on our imperialism then and now projects. We will take a look at Great Britain's involvement in India and China, specifically Hong Kong, as we get into next week. Okay? All right, folks, I appreciate you joining me today. I will talk to you later. Have a good day. Bye.